Welcome to our second week of dealing with the Hebrew Library as one of the stacks in our library. Last week we became acquainted with the first 5 books in the Hebrew Library, the Torah, the books of instruction, but this week we begin an exploration of the prophets. Now this is a group determined in 95 AD, a group of 21 books. And at first look, this number is a surprise because 6 books, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, are included by the rabbis in 90 AD as prophecy. Now, the category in history in the Greek translation compiled in 270, these books, the ones I just mentioned, the 6, were not listed as books of prophecy. They were categorized as history, continuing in the Latin translation, continuing in the English translations. And therefore, most of us have grown up by saying these are history books. But these 6 books, from the perspective of 90 AD, were not history books. They were books of prophecy. Now, another way to, I think, grab hold of this distinction is a question. Is the story of a king more or less important than the story of the prophet who addressed the king? The Hebrew Library was organized with a clear answer to the question. The prophet was more significant for the story of faith formation of the Hebrew people, was more important than the reign of a king. In that day, the reign of the king might have been more considered to be more significant, King David. But history has proved that the message of the prophet was what was important in the faith formation, and therefore these books were books categorized as prophecy. Now, it's also important to clarify from looking at these books from the perspective of the Hebrew Library, the meaning of the word prophecy. For the rabbis in 90 AD, a prophet was one through whom God spoke. A prophet was a spokesperson for God. You see, in 90 AD, the decision was made that prophets who spoke the truth, often over against the establishment of kings and nations and temples and empires, they belonged in the Hebrew Bible because they spoke the truth for God in their day and in their age. The messages of the prophets, the truth of which was time-tested and proven by history, belonged in the Hebrew Library. You see, these through whom God spoke were not predictors of the future. They were proclaimers of truth in their day. Most often, the message was dated in the year of a certain king, in the year of a certain date, or during the reign of kings. established the circumstance and the events which the message of the prophets addressed. A better understanding, I think, in translation in 2023 is to refer to these through whom God spoke as preachers who proclaimed a message for a specific time which has turned out to be eternally true. Again, preachers who proclaimed a message for a specific time which has turned out to be eternally true. These preachers were not predictors of the future. They spoke for God in their present day. Now, through these preachers, the faith of the Hebrew people was formed. The defining component of the faith of the Hebrew people was two words, and it's referred to as ethical monotheism. Now, monotheism is the faith in one God, but it was in a cultural context. Ethical monotheism was in a cultural context of many different understandings of God. Let's just name three. The first one being polytheism, poly meaning many gods. The cultures of the day, most of them believed in many gods. Then there was the second understanding of God, and that is what is referred to as henotheism. And they believed in many gods, but one God was primary. For instance, every nation had their own God. They believed in many gods, but their nation had a God, one above the others. The third was monotheism, the belief in one God. That was radically different than the norm of the cultures of the day. And the Hebrew preachers, through the centuries, advanced and clearly proclaimed the Hebrew people as the people who believed in one God. But there was more to the message of the preachers than monotheism. It is ethical monotheism. Ethics meaning behavior, the way we live. Today, I think faith and morality are intimately related for most. But that was not the case in the centuries during which these Hebrew preachers proclaimed their message. The Hebrew preachers started from scratch in human history to proclaim the belief, for instance, in one God of mercy and justice, which meant to be a person of the Hebrew faith, one had to be committed to work for mercy and justice. That's ethics. You see, the belief in the one God of love meant that the morality of the believer had to be formed on the foundation of love. Now let's just use, for example, two prophets, one early prophet, one late prophet. Micah, an early prophet, 9th century. What do we remember about Micah, the preacher's message? What does the Lord require? Not sacrifices, but rather to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Then spans 600 years to one of the later prophets, Jonah, whose message was not one of exclusion and judgment that has sort of prevailed through the years, but one of inclusion and grace for all. Yes, even the Gentiles, even Nineveh. So just picking out two prophets, Micah, Jonah, over 600 years, we see how ethical monotheism was formed by all of these preachers through the years. This, in a nutshell, is the formation of the faith of the Hebrew nation, which was represented in the selection of these 21 books, which is really the heart of the Hebrew library. The Torah, to be sure, the books of instruction to be graven on the hearts of the children of the Hebrew nation. To be sure, it's foundational. But the accumulative message of the prophets formed the faith of the Hebrew nation, ethical monotheism, which, let's be reminded, in 2023, as we look back through history to look at the Hebrew library that was formed in 90 AD, ethical monotheism became the basis of the two other Western religions of our world, Islam and Christianity. Both are formed through the message of the Hebrew preachers, ethical monotheism. Wow. Now, next week, we'll continue our exploration of these preachers by lifting from these books the never-to-be-forgotten messages of several of the Hebrew preachers. But this introduction to the formation of faith of the Hebrew preachers raises some important questions for us to think about and consider. First of all, as we cherish the tradition of these Hebrew preachers, speaking the truth in love to the establishment of their day, who are those in history who have stood on the shoulders of these preachers by speaking the truth in love to the establishment of their day? A second question, who are those today who are speaking the truth in love to the establishment of our day? And finally, is the definition of prophets as preachers rather than predictors of the future helpful or disturbing to you in your own journey of faith? Thanks for being a part of our journey together.